It's every year at this time in my ministry that I am reminded of another time in my ministry when I was at Canadian Memorial United Church in Vancouver. Many of you may not be aware that Canadian Memorial United Church is the only other place in Canada outside of Ottawa where the books of remembrance exist. They sit on the altar, and every page, every day, a page is turned. The reason I remember it so profoundly is because I am one who was a profound, perhaps idiotic peacenik in the 60s. I won't bore you with the details of the journeys I took over time. But in my time at Canadian Memorial, it was the story of the Reverend Colonel Fallis, who is stationed at the Ypres salient, the Bulge, in the front lines of the Allied forces, which meant, in fact, that they were surrounded on three sides by the enemy and suffered those unrelenting attacks. It was when he returned home to Vancouver, having witnessed the untold atrocities, and promptly he set about keeping a promise that he had made to those that he had buried as he was a chaplain, to build a sanctuary that was dedicated to peace. He felt that this was the one sane act he could imagine in the midst of the insanity of war. But now, for some of us, it will also be the same time of year, certainly at least for me, that I will always remember the election of a black man, Barack Obama, as the President of the United States of America. This event for me is right up there with other events that have happened in my lifetime in history that some of us never expected to happen. You know, such as the fall of the Berlin Wall or the end of apartheid in South Africa. I remember, perhaps you do as well, when Obama gave his speech at Grant Park in Chicago, just like a black preacher. He used that constant refrain. Do you remember what it was? Yes, we can. Which was echoed back by all the people that were gathered there. And you know something? I recalled in listening to it that I believed it. That we believed it. The people around the world believed it. We were witnesses to the impossible until it ignited the imaginations of so many about new possibilities in life. That the world would become reacquainted with hope and with love. That our world could be changed into a place of light, the light of God. Now, it's important to understand that the Bible regards the problem of violence as the central problem facing humanity. On page 6, at least of one of the translations of the Bible, God looks out over humanity and feels like God has made a mistake. God looks upon the violence in the heart of humanity and decides to start over, to send a flood to cleanse the earth of the human ones, saving only a remnant to start creation anew. In fact, it's possible to look at the whole of Jesus' teaching, along with his death, as an attempt to help humanity transcend our tendency to turn to violence to solve the problem of violence. Peter asked Jesus, you will recall, how many times do we need to forgive another As many as 7? Jesus responds. 7 times 70 times. A direct reference to the curse of Lamech, Noah's father in Genesis. The first murder is by Cain of his brother Abel. Knowing that Abel's sympathizers will try to avenge his death, God promises that whoever kills Cain will suffer a 7-fold vengeance. Jesus is intentionally reversing the age-old strategy of threatening or enacting retaliation as a means of controlling further violence. This curse is still with us today. The gunslangs that are rampant throughout the entire GTA, where my home is, some of them between gangs. This is, in fact, a modern-day manifestation of this ancient strategy. But as René Girard, an anthropologist and professor of literature, points out, this kind of violence is merely contagious. These gang-related slayings are only a microcosm of the violence that is the curse of the entire human species. And yet here we are today sitting, some 18 years into the 21st century, with retaliatory violence continuing to always be our default position. Nations, states, ethnic groups, gangs, and individuals continue to unconsciously believe that retaliatory violence is an effective way of dealing with violence. And yet, you and I who call ourselves Christians and attempt to abide to the teachings of Jesus and his manner of death, they show us an alternative that requires spiritual discipline. The discipline of forgiveness and love. It is best expressed in the Great Commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. But this is no easy task. The book by war journalist Christopher Hedges, entitled "War is a Project That Gives Life Our Meaning," in it he refers to the high he got in covering war zones around the world. Times, he said, when he lived on razor's edge between life and death. He says, ironically, he never felt so alive than when he was facing death. He says, I have witnessed a good number of people who seem to revel in conflict. Keeping it alive gives their life meaning. Ending it would render life slightly boring and throw one into a crisis of meaning. End of quote. I have to say to you, I'm serious about this. Many people love to keep family conflicts going because without them, life would have no drama. By the way, congregations are families. So let me ask this. When a nation bases a good portion of their economy around a military-industrial complex and is intent on being a dominant power in the world, what incentive is there to find an alternative to war? The spiritual practice of forgiveness does not fit with the agenda because there is nothing to replace the ideology of dominance as a meaningful project. And yet the geniuses of leaders like Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., was that they could offer a transcendent vision for a nation. Something other than dominance, a vision of greatness that was focused around justice and compassion. So if this is truly our agenda, then forgiveness, you see, is a necessary tool. When dominance is the name of the game, that is, if we want to show the other that we are superior and more righteous, smarter, or if we are passionate about putting them in their place, lower than us, then forgiveness is always a non-starter. Now, this can only make sense from beyond a level of consciousness that divides the world into us and them. From a tribal, ethnocentric worldview, the other exists as a threat. You will recall just a few years ago now what was happening in some of the smaller towns in Quebec. The manifestation of an ethnocentric level of consciousness that was taking place. The fear is that if we let those others into our province, then our identity will be threatened. Therefore, they must be willing to relinquish their otherness by becoming like us before we'll ever accept them. Evangelical Christians will accept gays the moment they stop being different from them and convert to heterosexuality. I'll start loving you again the moment you change into what I want you to be. The blows being struck here are not physical, but they hurt every bit as much. It's a form of systemic violence perpetrated by those who are stuck at an ethnocentric worldview. We also have our own intolerant behavior towards those who are different in other ways than us. I'm certain all of us here today could name a few. 70%, it's interesting to know, of the world's religions are stuck at this ethnocentric level of development. What this means, practically speaking, is that we are fated to reenact violence over and over again until we come up with an intentional strategy to help get religions unstuck. One of the primary strategies for those at a higher level of consciousness who have the capacity to see what's going on is to love their enemies into the next stage of consciousness. You will remember, I'm sure some of you, that was in fact Martin Luther King's strategy. Here is what he said. To our most bitter opponents, we say, we will match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to endure suffering. We shall meet your physical force with soul force. Do to us what you will, and we shall continue to love you. Bomb our homes, threaten our children, and we shall still love you. Send your hooded perpetrators of violence into our communities at the midnight hour, and beat us and leave us half dead, and we shall still love you. One day we shall win freedom, but not only for ourselves. We shall so appeal to your heart and to your conscience that we shall win you in the process, and our victory will be a double victory. End of quote. What a profound and incredible act of leadership. I mean this in a particular way. In the act of loving his enemy, Dr. King acts as an attractor to pull him up to a higher level of consciousness. At one and the same time, he is elevating not only his own followers, which is crucial in the evolution of religious consciousness, but also the enemy. The enemy is treated as a brother or sister who is simply acting foolishly, out of sync with his own nature. And if the enemy wants an image of what the higher nature is, All he must do is listen to the words of the very one he is in the act of destroying. Hanging from the cross, Jesus says to God with his enemies overhearing, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." They are in the midst of crucifying their true selves. You and I keep hope and love hidden away in the deep recesses of our psyches until we perceive that it is safe enough to let it come out. It's like oxygen for our souls. We cannot live without it, but we are afraid to breathe too deeply of it. It can hurt to breathe too deeply. Then, every once in a while, somebody comes along and is willing to embody hope on behalf of our humanity. Nelson Mandela, Bishop Tutu, and I'll say now, still to this day, Barack Obama. The lungs of our hearts open, tears flow, hope, the exiled virtue, returns home. Dare we hope for peace in the same way? Can we join in the refrain of the world that still is out there saying, yes, we can? When it comes to putting flesh on hope as the presence of peace in the world? The Golden Rule is the universal moral code. It is present in some form in most of the world's traditions. Toward the end of a church service, a story is told by one minister that goes like this. Apparently, he said to the congregation, "How many of you have forgiven your enemies?" One small elderly lady raises her hand. "Mrs. Jones, how is it that you have managed to forgive all of your enemies?" "I don't have any," said Mrs. Jones, smiling sweetly. "Mrs. Jones, that's very unusual. How old are you?" 98, she replied. "Oh, Mrs. Jones, would you please come down the center aisle to the front and tell us how a person who is 98 years old would not have an enemy in the world?" The sweet lady tottered down to the front of the church. She turned around and she faced the congregation and she said, "Because I outlived them all." That's one way to do it. Another way is to learn to love your own perfections and in so doing become more compassionate to others. I say this to you. In the name of love, one day you will find yourself sitting at your office desk, and in the twinkling of an eye you get apprehended by the Spirit of Jesus. And suddenly you see the futility of violence. You decide right there and then that you're going to be involved for whatever life you have left in the sacred project of working it out some other way. Your own life will change. You never know when the possibility of peace might grab you by the collar and carry you away into another realm. It's a realm of hope. You awaken to a gospel promise that love will find a way, and it suddenly dawns on you that it might as well start with you. You begin making connections between social justice and peace. You go to that person who has always bugged you, and you ask whether the two of you might work it out another way. You find yourself maybe writing to your local MP, asking honest questions about why we're at war and what it means to her. The Spirit of Jesus has apprehended you. It's come upon you as suddenly as a flood, except that's what's washing over your life. not death. It's a baptism of light that's flooding your soul, a catastrophe of conscience that's sweeping you away and carrying you into a new creation. Your whole life suddenly becomes a march for peace. Suddenly, your very life is like a placard that reads, "Let's work it out some other way." May it be so for you. May it be so for me.